Hello, and welcome to this edition of the Trend Alert. I'm Rom Gayoso, joined by Joyce Gioia, American futurist. Hi, Joyce. How are you doing today?
Great to see you, Rob. It's
How
been
wonderful to see you. So it looks like today we're going to cover this week's edition of the Trend Alert, which is published on the Herman Group every week. So this week you decided to talk a little bit about, information, the use of information, research, and misinformation. Why is that?
well, I made a mistake, and my brother caught it. And I never, ever, ever want to be accused of promoting misinformation. And that's what he said I had done. And I was so embarrassed that not only did I print a retraction in the next trend alert, but I also wanted to explore what I and others could do to not make that mistake.
Yes, certainly nobody wants to make a mistake, but sometimes we do, and I think it's important that we have people like you that come in and explain, hey, this is what the issue is, this is what went wrong, and certainly we're going to talk about how can things can go well, and then we all learn and we move on. So how can we really distinguish between true and good and valid research from misinformation? How can we
Well,
go
there's
about doing
several tactics that we can use. One of them is to consider the source. We want to make sure that the research is valid. We want to look at what is the background of the people who are conducting this research. Uh, is it published in a peer-reviewed journal? Are the newspapers and television programs reputable, or do they have a reputation for promoting misinformation? Misinformation can manipulate people, it can manipulate public opinion, it can be used to sell product, and it unfortunately it's used intentionally far too often. So what we need to do is to exercise our critical thinking skills and look at all of the things that contribute to the validity or the lack thereof of a particular report, study, or source.
I think you bring out a very important point here. So I think it's okay, and sometimes we do make mistakes. And yes, indeed, it is misinformation. But some people out there do it in purpose, which is disinformation, right? So we have misinformation and we have disinformation, and sometimes a mistake can be used or leveraged by others that have an agenda, and then it becomes disinformation and becomes used elsewhere to create confusion, intentionally create confusion. So not just a human error, but rather someone trying to take advantage of that human error and capitalize one way or another. So I think it's important that you mentioned that. So let's how is it that then that when we look at study design and a good use of study design, how does it help?
Well, you may or may not be aware of this. I suspect you are, but we can ask questions to elicit a particular response. And when we ask questions in a particular way, we're more likely to get the response that we're looking for than not get the response that we're looking for. And so we need to really be concerned about if it's a survey, uh, what do the questions look like? Who is the organization? What is the organization that is conducting the study as well? But the study design can be manipulated as well to to really be biased. And in fact, a little bit later, I hope in this particular program, we're going to talk about a time when it was really manipulated a lot. to come up with a result that was way out of line. So it's very important that the study design as well as the survey questions be as unbiased as possible.
Well, in the trend alert, you also talk a little bit about following the money, right? So why is it important that we understand who is funding this study?
Indeed, the study that I had used that was actually published in Human Resource Executive magazine, not the entire study, but this reference to it, was conducted by the United Health Group, which is uh, the United Health Insurance uh, organization. And they they had a vested interest in having this study show that emergency department visits were unnecessary. And so that is exactly what the result was. There are there are some somewhat unscrupulous uh, a accountants who will ask you, what do you want to pay in taxes, and then they'll back into that number. I think sometimes that studies are done starting with the results that the funding source is looking for, and backing into the results that they're looking for. And I believe that that's what was done here. And the reason was that it costs on average between 75 and $225 for an emergency department, for an in-office visit, where it can cost between $1,700 and $2,200 for an emergency department visit. So the difference between the office visit and the emergency department visit is very, very significant. And it costs insurance companies a lot. So they have a vested interest in people choosing not to use emergency departments.
Yeah, and it's actually very easy to create such a misleading question. Don't you think some people panic too easily and go to an emergency hospital? You can create questions in a way that people say, yes, right? Yes, people panic easily. Oh, you shouldn't, right? Oh, yeah, no, I should not do that. Yeah, right. It's kind of crazy, but unfortunately, some people create studies and in design questionnaires in this way or in that manner, so that people give the answer that they're looking for. Now, you also talk a little bit about evaluating the output. How can we do that? Give us some tips and tricks.
If I had looked at those numbers and thought about them, what I wrote in my original trend alert was that something like 70% of emergency department visits could be avoided or prevented. And if I had thought about it a minute, I would have said, wait a minute, that's not, it doesn't compute. It doesn't make sense. So we need to use those critical thinking skills that I was talking about. We also can look at whether there are other studies which corroborated the same result, which had the same output as the one we want to quote. And there were no other studies which corroborated the result of the United Health study.
Yeah, I think you're making several very good points here, and of course, this can be a much longer conversation. But again, looking at the entity that is funding, right, combined with so what is being said, the message, and so evaluating the output, the way you place it, and people really needs to remember that there's a significant difference, and you touched on this in terms of having a review study where there's a blind review, at least three peers that evaluate the study versus position paper that was published not in a peer-reviewed journal. So not in a journal, not in the journal of, but rather in some other institution, or sometimes paid by a political party, a private entity, or maybe it is a think tank. So someone who has a vested interest one way or another in the outcome of the study. If they're involved, I think, as you mentioned, we have to question. Okay, so who is writing the study? And so you're saying that all along, who is writing it? um, who's paying for this, what is being said, right? And do they have a vested interest in the outcome? So I think that when we put all those strategies together, that's a good way to evaluate, is it not?
Yes, Ram, and you would think that when we look at the organization that's sending out this data, that if I said to you that there was an agency, a department of an agency of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, you would automatically give that a level of credibility. However, as the Wall Street Journal reported, there was a study that was promoted by the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, which is part of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and it's supposed to produce research to improve healthcare in the country. But on December 30th, 2022, the Wall Street Journal reported, and here's the headline: a study sounds a false alarm about America's emergency rooms. And shockingly, the AHRQ study had been based on one fatality in an emergency room in Canada in 2004. That it, and the it was just craziness that it said that so many people died as a result of going to emergency rooms. I mean, it's just nuts.
So they basically cherry pick the data and use the data to come up with, to justify
They
whatever.
definitely cherry picked that data.
That's one very specific Rainier cherry out
One
of
data
Canada. Okay.
point.
Okay. Now, Joyce, you also talk a little bit about unconscious bias. And so what role does it play in this game?
We need to be aware of our unconscious biases. And I've talked about this before when I talked about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that is that we all have unconscious biases. And what we need to do is just make sure that they do not creep into our evaluation of output, our study design, our our creation of survey questions. We really need to be very careful when we are conducting that research that our unconscious bias stays out of the picture.
Okay, and folks, there is a shocking example. We just have about a minute. Can you just give me a brief introduction about the shocking example? And folks, you have to go to the Herman Trend Alert and read all about it. But this, we
Well,
want to hear a little bit about it.
well, we actually did. We talked about the fact that that data was based on one data point, and that was my shocking example. So I'm going to jump into what the future holds for this area of inquiry, if that's okay. So there's been a rapid proliferation of platforms and an exponential use of data. There's no doubt that there will be increasing examples of how data is misinterpreted. However, you now have a roadmap for avoiding being taken in by bad science and other misinformation. So, by following the guidelines that we've talked about today in today's Future Short, you can help yourself be more accurate.
Wonderful. And folks, www.hermangroup.com. That's where you find this week's edition of the Trend Alert. Joyce, thank you so very much for being here with me in the audience today. And I hope to see you again next week on another edition of our Trend Alert.